Chapter 23, Recuperation. Things seemed to calm down a little, so Saberclaw sat, her back braced against the wall as she held Lockjaw's relaxed hand. She sighed and looked over to Silver Spot and Razor Wing. Thanks, Silver, for that information. What happened? I can't remember much before we got here. Silver Spot's face fell to a grim expression as she explained what had happened. About 30 minutes later, Saberclaw was so guilty she was practically yelling at Silver Spot. What? I didn't mean to hurt you and Razor Wing, and I fought Rebay as hard as I could. I promise, she exclaimed. Silver Spot chuckled a little and comforted Saberclaw through the bars. It's okay, Saber. I'm more concerned about you and Lockjaw as of right now. Rebay's mind control is so powerful that no one had ever broken it without Rebay's permission before. I heard her control is a terrible feeling. She spoke through the bars as if they weren't even there. Saberclaw glanced over at Lockjaw's relaxed face as she answered. Yeah, it was terrible. It is more frightening than painful, though. At first, there is as much pain as your determination to fight, but then you just are trapped in a cage that you are accustomed to controlling. And when you find that you can't even control your own thoughts, and you're forced to be someone else, is the worst part. She looked at Silver Spot's pitying eyes and sighed heavily. She felt Lockjaw's limp hand in hers and remembered the unusual feeling she had for him. She could kill 100 Nextari soldiers, but couldn't conquer the feeling of love. This initially scared her, but she found herself smiling because of how much she liked the feeling. It made her want to be around Lockjaw, and now that he wasn't under Rebay's mind control, she felt that it was okay to be vulnerable around him. She realized that Lockjaw hadn't said a word in the past hour or so, and she felt something touch her body. She looked down, and panic began to consume her as she realized what it was. G was forming a puddle around her and Lockjaw, and it glowed eerily. She looked over and realized that Lockjaw hadn't spoken because he was unconscious and his wounds had somehow reopened. His cuts were quickly leaking blue-green liquid, but the covering on his chest was still keeping his worst wound from leaking. Saberclaw turned her body to face Lockjaw, and she squeezed his hand, shaking him violently as she tried to wake him up. She called his name and noticed his eyes spark to life as he moved his head slightly toward her. He whispered, "Saber." His eyes softened when he looked at her, but found he didn't have the strength to finish his sentence. Saberclaw looked at Silver Spot for an answer and saw the medic shaking her head. This brought Saberclaw a terrible feeling because she knew it meant that there was not much that could be done for Lockjaw. He had lost too much G and needed some sort of infusion immediately to survive. Then, Saberclaw realized that the bars keeping her contained were quite large and spaced out. A human could easily fit through them. Saberclaw also realized that the warship was not far from the ground. She immediately stood and walked up to the bars, putting her hand through the bars. She looked from side to side and checked for nearby guards. She knew that the hangar had lots of G, and all she had to do was get to the base and back to save Lockjaw. However, she would have to go unnoticed and would have to be quick. She focused and changed to her human form. Alea looked behind her, checking on Lockjaw. The alien was by his side, but wasn't doing anything notable, and Lockjaw also hadn't seemed to notice her attempt to escape. She slid through the bars, shushing Silver Spot and Razor Wing as her small footsteps echoed quietly. She hid behind one of the beams supporting the ceiling when a soldier walked by. The warship's security wasn't built for creatures as small as humans, so her small feet didn't set off any traps or alarms. She ran as fast as she could down random corridors for about 30 minutes. Then she realized that she wasn't getting anywhere. The ship was like a maze, and there were probably only a few ways out. Alea was about to give up from all of the pressure she felt she was under when she saw a map on a nearby wall. Apparently, she was only one right turn away from an exit. She rushed down the final hallway when she was forced to hide. 2 soldiers were casually patrolling when Alea spotted them, and she hid behind another pillar, her hand covering her mouth as she tried to be as quiet as possible. The soldiers walked past her so close that it was a surprise that they didn't recognize her. If they had turned around, they would have spotted her. Her eyes were wide with the hope they wouldn't turn around when they stopped walking. making her anxiety spike. She didn't dare to run. They would immediately hear her if she tried. It became clear that they had indeed noticed her when she overheard one of them call for backup. Out of instinct, she changed back into Saberclaw and threw her 2 daggers at their heads. Each one struck perfectly, and the Nextari soldiers were on the ground, dead in seconds. She quickly retrieved her daggers, looking around her for more Nextari. She looked behind her, and, sure enough, about 10 more were coming at her. One stopped running and fired its blaster at her. The ball of plasma rushed past her head, barely missing her. She stumbled backwards out of surprise as they quickly got closer. She sprinted away, occasionally shooting a plasma blast back at them. She found that she was approaching an open doorway out into a familiar forest. She had been in this forest more than the Nextari, so she knew ways that she could lose them easily. She made a blind leap out of the doorway and found herself falling about 25 feet. She landed on the ground safely, but only because of her metal stabilizers on her feet. The Nextari chasing her couldn't do this, so they continued firing at her from the warship instead. She continued running when she heard the whistle of a plasma blast hurling towards her. Many had come close to her, but this one must have been close enough to hit her. She felt the snapping of metal and felt a painful, burning sensation in her left leg. She yelped and looked down to check on her leg. A large wound was sending searing pain through her, but another blast near her reminded her that she still needed to escape. She pushed through the pain and continued running forward. She thought she had lost them when she noticed some were still trailing behind her. She groaned out of irritation and pain as she continued running. She could get away much faster if she flew, but the tree canopy was too thick to fly out of. She saw a light and ran as fast as she could to it as blasts hissed by her head. They exploded the ground near her, but missed her. Saberclaw reached the light, and it was very bright. She shielded her eyes until she could see properly. She had come upon a road with cars that stopped as she froze suddenly. She was in plain sight. Still, plasma blasts were whizzing dangerously close to her, and she knew she couldn't stay there for long. On the other side of the road, a news company was filming live on some other topic, but became severely interested in her. All of the cameras focused on her, and the man, who was talking, gestured wildly and spoke with excitement. Saberclaw looked down the road and saw Grove Academy in the distance. Children were entering the school, and Saberclaw finally got a sense of what time it was. She must have been locked in the warship all night because the school welcomed students in the early morning. The current soldiers chasing her hadn't seen her in her human form, so they wouldn't think anything of another student entering the school. Besides, she had too many absences on her record anyway. A wave of pain hit her in her leg. She groaned and looked down to see her leg leaking quickly. She pushed through it and ran towards the school, soldiers and news reporters following her. Once she approached the school, she ducked back into the woods. She quickly changed into her human form. Alea began to walk into the school as casually as she could. She looked behind her cautiously, watching the soldiers rush through the shadows away from the school. She smiled to herself at how gullible the Nextari were, but she was humbled by the pain in her leg. She pulled up her pant leg a little to reveal perfectly healthy skin. According to the way her body worked, her robot self's injuries would cause her pain as a human, but they wouldn't be visible. She was forced to limp into the school and wasn't inside for even a minute before she was spotted. She saw Kaylin walk quickly up to her, her curly hair bouncing as she moved. She raised her hand beside her head and cocked it behind her a little as she spoke. "Hey," she called. Alea recognized this posture as a greeting Lila had introduced as the high five. She also knew that Kaylin loved to high five people with all of her might, so she matched that. However, when their hands collided, the sound wasn't very loud, and Alea clutched her hand as she felt a burning sensation. Kaylin just laughed and commented, "Huh, are you okay?" She laughed loudly as Haley ran up behind her. Alea smiled painfully and opened her mouth, but had no words. Kaylin had talent. She could innocently inflict pain without inflicting any on herself. Haley smiled, but Alea had to dodge Madeline's pounce. Madeline made a fake sad face and said sarcastically, "What? You're supposed to let me get you, meanie. She joked as the other two girls walked up behind her. Sadie and Casey smiled in greeting, chatting with Alea as they went to their homeroom class together. Sadie noticed Alea's limp and occasional heavy sigh. Are you okay? What's wrong with your leg? She asked. Alea's eyes fluttered as she tried to think of an explanation. Sports incident. I'm fine. She silently hoped that Sadie wouldn't pry any more information out of her. And sure enough, Sadie shrugged and continued walking. Alea let out a sigh of relief, but began trying to hide her limp better. Her leg felt like it was on fire, but she refused to let it show. Time passed, and they were soon in second period since first period passed quickly. They were in some sort of break between classes when Rosalind seemed to teleport to Alea. Where have you been? Out frolicking with Callum, I see. He hasn't been here either, and you didn't come back with him. Where is he? She spoke with an arrogant tone. Alea wrinkled her nose and pressed her lips together as she stood up from her desk to face Rosalind. She really didn't want to talk about Lockjaw at the moment, because he was in a bad state when she last saw him. She was actually reminded that she needed to get the G and go, but Lockjaw would have to wait because she wasn't going to be able to find a reasonable excuse to leave. Alea was taller than Rosalind, so she got close to her and looked down at the rude girl. Alea just stared, but Rosalind wasn't giving up without a fight. Well, are you going to answer me or just stand there like an idiot? She spoke with a teasing tone, not knowing how much danger she was actually in. Alea answered with a deadly calm voice. Rosalind, leave me be. Callum just happens to not be here today, so you need to drop it. Her voice cracked a little as she said Callum's name. Rosalind huffed and turned on her heel, walking away to her little pack of friends. Alea sighed and sat back down. Her friends gathered around her and gossiped about Rosalind until the bell rang. Meanwhile, on the warship, Rebay had been notified of Saberclaw's escape. Rebay didn't know how the robot could have escaped, but that didn't matter. She was working with Boltar to try to track her down as another argument was going on inside the cells. The alien creature was desperately holding Lockjaw down as he fought with the little strength he had left. Lockjaw's voice quivered. She'll be killed when she tries to come back. I need to find her, he yelled as Silverspit scolded him through the bars. Razorwing had braced himself up against the wall and was shaking his head in disapproval. Lockjaw, Saberclaw will be fine, probably. Besides, there was no convincing her otherwise. Let's just hope she can get back here safely. She tried to comfort Lockjaw, but it was no use. The creature shoved Lockjaw back to the floor and said, Lockjaw, young Saberclaw was determined to save you, and if you die, then her sacrifice is in vain. This made Lockjaw relax a little, since he was still leaking heavily and he knew that he was dying. Lockjaw sighed, but responded with a heavy spirit. Exactly. She's trying to save me and will most likely be killed in the process. I can't just sit here and let that happen. He looked for sympathy, but the creature just nodded. She will be back, Lockjaw. I know it to be so, and it isn't your fault. Razorwing sighed heavily and stood up. Yeah, well, it really is. If she doesn't make it back here alive, it really is Lockjaw's fault. If we really go back to where this all began, she was only under mind control because of Lockjaw, and we only got captured because of Lockjaw and are still in here because of Lockjaw. She would have escaped and freed us if she didn't feel the need to save him. He reasoned with an angry tone. Silverspot turned quickly to face him, and Razorwing felt the pressure of her sharp eyes. Razorwing, we are in here because of you as much as him. All of us made a mistake that got us captured. If I had killed Saberclaw when I had the chance, then we would have won the fight. And if you hadn't gone easy on her during the battle, you also probably would have been able to destroy her. Silverspot's words cut deep into Razorwing because he hadn't thought of his own choices as mistakes. Everyone went silent as they reviewed things they had done wrong. Lockjaw let his head fall backwards as he felt his strength drain out of him along with his G that had formed a small puddle around him. The pain wasn't as much of an issue because he was numb at this point. His thoughts kept drifting to Saberclaw, and these thoughts were probably the only things keeping him conscious. He wanted to be awake for her return, and this was a challenge he was willing to attempt. He looked down at one of the bigger cuts on his leg and saw how bad it was. Boltar had slashed it into him in an attempt to find some sort of biological anomaly. He groaned from the memory, but was determined to stay awake. Alea's day had dragged on and school was now almost over. She sighed heavily as she glanced at the clock. Her current teacher was rambling on about her generation, and Alea looked out the window, watching for any threats. Finally, the final bell rang, and Alea sprinted out the door. A teacher in the hallway told her to slow down, but Alea ignored him. She burst through the doors, looking left and right to check for pursuers. She ran at a normal human speed until she got out of sight, and then changed back in her robot form. Saberclaw cried out from the pain in her leg, clutching it tightly as she paused. It looked like a serious wound, but she didn't have time to treat it. She rushed through the familiar woods until she came upon the hangar. She grabbed the garage door and grunted as she forcefully lifted it out of her way. The large main room was intact, so she grabbed a few syringes and ran back out. She remembered where the warship was, but she wasn't entirely sure where to enter it and how she was going to get there without being spotted. Saberclaw stopped and hid behind a rock as she approached the hull of the large ship. There was a large ramp leading into the ship, but it was crawling with Nextari soldiers. Saberclaw tried to use her telekinesis and found she now had enough mental strength. She waved her hand, and two of the soldiers went flying into another group. They immediately stood up, and all of the soldiers began to point their weapons, alert and knowing that they were being attacked. She crouched behind a large boulder and focused on the woods behind them. A large tree fell, distracting the guards, and they ran towards it. This gave Saberclaw enough time to board the ship undetected. Saberclaw cautiously snuck down each hallway, making sure to avoid any eyes that could catch her. She could strut down the hall if she could become invisible like Razorwing, but she couldn't, so she had to occasionally duck behind pillars. Eventually, after looking at a few maps, she found a corridor with all of the cages built into the walls. Saberclaw rushed to the one containing Lockjaw and whispered his name to get his attention through the bars. Lockjaw immediately perked up and was about to celebrate her return when she shushed him. "Quiet. Inject these into yourself, and you should feel better. I'll see if I can free the others." She handed the syringes through the bars, and the creature she had befriended brought them to Lockjaw. He, without hesitating, injected them into his arm until he had no more left. He sighed from relief as he felt his strength returning. He thanked Saberclaw as she silently walked over to Silverspot's and Razorwing's shared cage, her leg burning with every step. She peered into the cage, but saw neither of her teammates. She cocked her head to the side with confusion, but felt that something was terribly wrong. She felt something hit her back, slamming her body against the bars as she fell to the floor. She groaned and felt weak, but didn't lose consciousness and heard Lockjaw yelling. A large Nextari soldier was looming over her. He must have spotted her and hit her hard. He grabbed her by the wing and began dragging her down the hall as she fought. She found that she couldn't control her body very well and struggled to escape his grip. Lockjaw had also been dragged out of the cage by another soldier and was leaving a trail of G as he was forced to move. Saberclaw screamed for them to let her and Lockjaw go, but the soldiers ignored her. She kicked and fought, but was in too much of a panic to actually stand a chance. Before she knew it, she was being forced into a large, empty room. Lockjaw was thrown in behind her, and she threw a dagger at the door. However, the door closed before the dagger went through, and it hit the metal, clanking to the floor. Saberclaw slammed her fists on the floor with anger and looked up to check on Lockjaw. He was struggling to sit up, but seemed to be fine for the most part. She looked at her surroundings and noticed that she and Lockjaw weren't alone. Silverspot and Razorwing had been sitting, but were now standing in the corner of the room. Razorwing ran over to Saberclaw and grabbed her, lifting her in the air as he hugged her tightly. She struggled under his grip, but hugged him back with happiness. "Oh, Razor, I'm so happy to actually be able to directly talk to you again," she exclaimed. He smiled and put her down, running his hand over the side of her face. "Saber, I was so worried. I thought you had died or been put in interrogation." The two smiled at each other stupidly as they reunited. Silversput helped Lockjaw stand as she smiled at the two robots. Lockjaw clenched his jaw with angry jealousy, but didn't want to interrupt Saberclaw's happiness. Silverspot set Lockjaw down up against a wall as she also reunited with Saberclaw. She hugged Saberclaw and spoke softly as they held each other. "I am so glad you're all right." She grabbed Saberclaw by her shoulders and held eye contact with her. "Now, don't you ever do that again, got it?" she asked with a chuckle as she released Saberclaw. The green robot nodded as she rushed over to Lockjaw. Saberclaw squeezed Lockjaw's hand as she asked, "All right, now how are you doing?" Her eyes gleamed with concern. Lockjaw smiled and answered, "Is it my turn to talk to you now?" "But, yes, I feel a lot stronger now." His look of contentment settled Saberclaw's worried mind. She sat by his side as they examined each other. Suddenly, his optics went wide, and he quickly made his hand hover over her injured leg. "What happened?" "Your leg." He trailed off as he looked at the melted metal and blue-green, dried G running down her leg. Silverspot immediately turned around and placed her hand on the wound. Saberclaw winced with pain as Silverspot looked up at her. "Yes, Saberclaw, I also wish to know what happened. However, I think this is a Nextari weapon blast wound. Am I correct?" she asked as Saberclaw nodded. Now that Saberclaw wasn't being pressured for survival, she could feel the pain more clearly. She couldn't help but wince as Silverspot examined her. Razorwing leaned against the wall and rolled his eyes with his arms crossed. "I knew you shouldn't have gone back to the base. Also, now none of us can escape since we are walled in." He glared at the walls. Saberclaw sneered, "Oh, stop complaining." She didn't want to deal with his dramatics. Lockjaw smiled at her spicy tone. Razorwing was quickly silenced and just watched as Silverspot shook her head. She finally stood up and said, "Well, the wound is severe, but it won't kill you if I don't treat it right now. Speaking of which, I will need to treat it at some point as well as the rest of our wounds, so we need to figure out an escape plan." Saberclaw stood up and limped over to the walls, feeling them closely. She also pressed her head against the hard, metal-like material. "The walls are thick, so I don't think we can blast through them. Also, there are no mechanisms or anything that we can sabotage." She huffed and looked at the rest of the robots. They each looked frustrated as Silverspot examined the door closely. Razorwing was so angry and frustrated that he gave up and punched the wall. He turned to Lockjaw and glared at him. He was angry that the blue robot seemed to be doing nothing. However, Lockjaw was indeed contributing. He was deep in thought about the layout of the room. It was definitely a stronghold with thick walls and a strong door keeping them in. However, it had slid open previously without being pushed or any buttons being pressed. This made Lockjaw assume it must have some sort of mechanism. Any mechanism can be tampered with. One would just have to figure out how.